I was going to do. So today I'm going to be talking to Dr. Darren Stevens, the creator of constructive development theory. I've known Darren for a number of years now, and as someone who has personally benefited from his coaching, it's a real privilege to be having this conversation with him. Good afternoon, Darren. It's great to see you this afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Loving the fish tank there, loving the fish tank.
Yeah, it's a bit more calming, isn't it?
Yes, it's definitely a little more calming than the usual summer house. So, as the creator of constructive development theory, it'd be interesting to find out a little bit more about how the idea came about. What was the genesis of the idea?
I was working with some master's level students in London at a university in London, and I was using the Identity Compass profile system. And what I noticed was that the profiles were coming out very, very different. So you've seen the profile, but for the people looking, you have a bar like this, and some of the people were this much on internal, external, but some were this much. Yeah. And then in about 2012, I started looking at levels of adult development by a guy called Robert Kegan and another one called Otto Lasky. Kegan looked at the social emotional aspects and Lasky looked at the cognitive. Well, I thought, well, hang on a second. Looking at the Identity Compass, is it possible that the students are actually showing us different levels of development in their combinations of these, what I've called cognitive intentions, internal, external, towards, away from? And if so, is that a shortcut to Lasky's system? So that's how I did it. And the idea was, it was a solid idea, and I'd been working with it for a couple of years. And my brother said, you might want to turn that into a PhD just to give it some validity and some rigor. And unfortunately, he was right.
Yeah, and it was a great PhD. It took a while to get through it, but yeah, it was a real sense of something really important coming from it. So yeah, it was really good to read that, and I'm glad that your brother-in-law encouraged you to do it. So you talk about a few different things in your theory, and probably one of the most predominant things in there is dynamic intelligence. So can you tell us a little bit about what dynamic intelligence is, and is it different from CDT, or is it a part of it?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the website, it does say that constructive development theory is about the shortcuts and how we know. Well, dynamic intelligence is the process by which we combine those cognitive intelligences, those cognitive intentions rather, how they create our thinking style once they're combined. It's actually that process. How do we know what we know about our thinking? And then if, for example, we tweak them, the change in the process of how we think is our dynamic intelligence. So the more aware you are, the more aware you are, the greater your dynamic intelligence, and that's measured by the thinking quotient scale, which you probably might ask me about in a while. But so dynamic intelligence for me is your capacity to pull in as many things as possible in the moment. So when I give talks about this, I have a slide where I use a guy called Calvin and Hobbes, a cartoon character, and his tiger takes the mickey out of him, and he doesn't get it for about 5 hours. And then he just suddenly realizes, well, his capacity to make those connections in the moment weren't quite good enough. So on my scale, we have to bear in mind, though, that he was 6 years old. In my system, he would have been quite low dynamic intelligence. Whereas the more things you're capable of pulling in the moment, the higher your dynamic intelligence. Does that make sense?
Okay, that's really great. Yes, it does. It does indeed. So you mentioned there about thinking styles, and someone's that's had kids at school and they've all been tested. So I understand about learning styles. How does thinking style differ from learning styles? Are they the same thing, or?
No, that's an important differentiation. One of the things that we're limited by is our language, and learning styles, cognitive styles, things like that. They've been used in the language in education for quite a long time. So when I say thinking style, people might assume that it's related to visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or VARK, and it goes down to from a learning style perspective. However, there's not a lot of research on those that validate them as an approach for any kind of education. There's nothing that says a student who is visual prefers handouts. Well, we're all visual, and we're all auditory to some extent. So all the research on it, when I had to actually look into, I've got a section in my thesis that talks about learning styles. When you actually look into it, everybody does everything, and there's no real differentiation that says specifically you are V, you are A, you are K, that kind of thing. So the way I wrote about it in my thesis is that, well, of course, learning styles aren't real because they're missing the other 47 cognitive intentions that combine in your dynamic intelligence process to create your thinking style. So learning style is only a subset of your thinking style. Okay, and it doesn't work because they're missing the rest of them. That's how I explained it in the thesis. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. All those additional cognitive intentions that are measured by the identity compass, they all contribute to that thinking style and round it out, which is why the limited view of the thinking style just isn't really valid.
Of the learning style, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so thinking about the thinking quotient, then, can you explain how that works and what the formula is?
Well, the formula, I was going to say no then, but it's actually in my thesis. It makes no difference. Basically, what I did was when I was looking at the student profiles, I noticed that somebody was really, really socialized in how they think. And I noticed that what that meant was their external, partner, caring for others was all very high. But you compare that to somebody who is more internal and a little bit more, the locus of evaluation comes from themselves, then you notice that internal, own, caring for self might be a little higher. But what I also noticed was that if you are internal, external, or external, internal, doesn't make any difference. You're still limited because these two things are not necessarily the problem. The problem is the gap. The problem is your capacity to know whether you are internal or external and whether you can choose to use them or not. And in this case, you can't. In this case, you still can't. But in this case, you can. So the thinking quotient is actually the measure of the difference between the internal and external scores, which for me means that you don't know you're doing it. You do know you're doing it and can choose. Now that also means that you still know you're doing it. But what I also found in my study 4, I did the quantitative. The quantitative studies actually worked and brilliantly. Loads of stuff came out of the quant studies. I did 4 quant, and then I did a qualitative because what I needed to do was determine, do people actually do what these data are telling us they're doing? So I did some interviews, and it shows that actually the person that is massively external does know that they're external, but can't change it. And that was an important differentiator for me because it also showed that the profiles were true, the thinking quotient scale worked. They didn't know what internal was in order to change their behavior sufficiently to then eventually develop choice. And that's all we're looking at here. So in essence, constructive development theory, dynamic intelligence, thinking styles is all about your level of awareness of your choice, which is why I then developed the 4 pillars of constructive development, which, as you know, are intention, awareness, choice, and response. And we can, if you ask any questions on those later, then they map across to all kinds of different arenas in how we think, whether it's, psychology or fixing motorbikes or martial arts.
Okay, and within the thinking quotient, there are levels. Yeah. So how does that differ from Keegan's levels, for example, within the adult development space, or Lovinger or Lasky?
That's a really good question because despite me doing this for the last 10 years, I only figured this out the other day. Don't get me wrong, it's all over the thesis. It's there. So what happens is you layer on your understanding, is what I'm saying. So when I read a paper by someone the other day who follows Suzanne Cook-Greuter, who's a phenomenal researcher in her own right, and she's been doing it for years and years. So she automatically knows roughly what level someone is when she talks to them. And it's interesting because we've emailed each other. And what I noticed in the article written by this lady was the description of vertical development. Okay. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read it because it's easier because I haven't memorized it,
Yeah.
So she has seven levels, right? And she says, these stage models provide powerful and cutting edge clarity for how leaders can mature to the next level, right? And that's what cognitive complexity is about, maturity.
Yep.
They are, however, merely maps that guide development. To be useful, they need to be integrated with real life experience, motivation, and support. Right. So the important bit there is these stage models provide powerful and cutting edge clarity. And then in the next sentence, however, they're just maps. Well, which one is it? Do you see the problem?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether you're looking at Cook-Reuters, Lervinger's, Keegan's, even Lasky's, they're just descriptions. And I'm going to name a couple more now because this is what I did. I actually did. The problem is stage transition. No one talks about stage transition. You can look all over LinkedIn for people who are doing development courses or whatever, workshops, and they give you all these lovely names for each stage and lots of description. But if you probe and say, well, can you tell me specifically what changes in their thinking that you know elevates them from here to here? They can't tell you. This is the difference between my system and the existing system so far is we construct our experience, we construct our motivation, we construct our support. Once you understand that everything is constructed, in order to move from one level to the next, there must be something that can be measured that you're constructing or unaware of that you're constructing, whatever, that we can measure and say, look, let's tweak this and your thinking will grow. That's the difference. In my system, we can pinpoint the things that change, and it's your intention, awareness, choice, and response in relation to the 50 cognitive intentions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, you talk a lot there about measurement, and obviously, you know, as a coach, I know other coaches. We use psychometrics a lot, and then you've kind of got the big five as well. So, how does your work impact on the big five and psychometrics?
Well, that's an interesting question because just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I gave a talk to an association that predominantly uses trait theory and big five and variations on the big five in all of their work. All right, so they work with organizations, that kind of thing. And I gave a talk about how Ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, Ocean, the big five, are what could be called nominalizations. In other words, you can't put 10 kilograms of openness into a wheelbarrow and walk out of a shop with it. Again, it's a description, just like the development models. And this is where I think that my thinking around this has become much more balanced over the last 3 or 4 years. Yes, I'm in about 2 seconds, I'm going to tell you why I don't like trait theory. But by the same token, every single system of adult development and cognitive complexity has the same issue. And this issue is something called essentialism. In trait theory, it's definitely essentialism, which manifests as something called psychometric isomorphism. And what that means is every lecture I went to at the conferences where someone's talking about, you know, we've mapped openness to agreeableness. Well, I can guarantee you that they knew the answer before they did any kind of survey. Of course, openness maps to agreeableness. And of course, the 10 facets underneath agreeableness map to the 10 facets underneath openness, just depending on how you ask the questions and how you then look at the statistics, because you can make statistics say anything you like. For me, it's an obviousness. What we don't get is why. What we don't get is what happens if agreeableness is an unconscious habit. How do you do neuroticism? You show me how you do neuroticism and I'll do it the same way you do. And we can both be neurotic in the same way. But that never happens because people don't know they're neurotic until they do a test. There's no awareness there. There's no intention there, but there's no awareness of that intention. They have no choice because they don't know they're neurotic until they get the test results, and therefore they can't respond differently. What is the point of knowing traits, the big five, if they're not a choice? If they're an habituated pattern, it seems rather pointless. So what I did, and I've got a research paper on this, and I've given presentations, as I said, on it. What I put into my thesis was that if you inject intention, awareness, choice, response into the big five, you get a much more robust animal. You can then determine how much of openness is actually a conscious choice in someone's acting and behaving. Does that make sense? In how they think and behave. Yeah. And that's the difference between this system and the trait stuff that's gone before.
So you mentioned there about the injection of intention, awareness, choice, and response into the big five. And have you noticed any correlation between the big five personality factors and any patterns that you've observed within the identity compass and dynamic intelligence? Is there something around kind of high openness with high awareness or anything like that?
Do you know what? No, because I don't know whether the person who does the test, the psychometric, say you're doing a job, say you're going for an interview or something like this, and you're asked to do the 16PF profile or Hogan's profile or anything like that. It is literally the question sets are, sometimes I feel blue. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you're cold? Does that mean you're feeling sad? Or does that mean you're dating a Smurf? What does it mean? Now we're hitting the problem. It's about meaning making, and meaning making and sense making are emotional complexity and cognitive complexity. And when you don't know what something means, what's the point of it being a question? So for me, the question set that determines how complexly someone thinks has to be completely different to, I find it difficult to control my temper. Because that depends, doesn't it? Personally, no, I don't find it difficult to control my temper. If I'm being angry, I'm angry on purpose. If I'm, being kind, that's my default setting. Maybe my kids would disagree, but that is my default setting. And this is the point: how much of my anger is at choice? How much of my openness is at choice? This is where my system actually takes on. As far as I'm concerned, as far as I've witnessed and experienced and written about so far, this is where the constructive development theory goes up a level from the traits and things like this. When I gave the talk, someone said that I'm not really saying anything different to a guy called Kelly from about 1955, who created something called personal construct psychology. And what he did is obviously part of what I've got here. However, what he didn't do was find out how aware one is and what the intention is, and if you can choose not to do it. Okay, what he did was he was doing it from a therapy perspective, whereas I don't do therapy at all. It doesn't matter that I've got a PhD in psychology, I'm not a therapist. Okay, I don't have that expertise. What I do is as you mentioned coaching, we take normal brains and make them more complex, or make them think, recognize the dialectic a bit more. And that's completely different to taking somebody who's at the other end of the spectrum and making them better. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned meaning making there. I mean, is meaning making contextual then? So do people think and act differently depending on the situation that they're in?
Yeah, and I've been teaching some university students as part of a degree down in London. And the meaning making is different for them because they're predominantly from India, Pakistan, China, Hong Kong, Korea, that kind of thing. So things that you and I take for granted, like the word through, meaning making is about context. Because if I put my hand through a wall, or if I threw the ball, you automatically create the context in your brain. But through is the same word spelled differently, clearly. So phonetically, through. So yeah, absolutely, context is key.
Yeah.
So if you construct yourself one way at work, I mean, we've always said this, haven't we? We've got different hats depending on where we are. We wear a different hat at home. Well, for me, it's not about wearing a different hat. It's about construction of self. Let's take somebody who works in a bank, for example. If they are high up in the bank, they need to construct their thinking at such a level that their own level of complexity matches the role complexity. And this is where it's useful for organizational development. I mean, Elliot Jacques did this, Michael Commons, people like this. And they have to match that role complexity. If they don't, they burn out. Or if they're above the level, they get bored and leave anyway. When they come home, they don't need to be this high level thinker because they're dealing with their, dopey husband or their kids or something like this. So they quite, can come down to what Keegan would call the socialized mind, which would be his stage 3 or Lasky's stage 3. But in work, they've definitely got to be stage 4. So from a contextual perspective, to know how you construct your thinking at work and do it at choice, and go home and choose to construct your thinking differently at home, maybe when surrounded by family, that to me is a completely different idea to we wear different hats, because we're now impacted our intention, awareness, choice, and response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you gave a couple of kind of, I suppose, general examples. Have you got any kind of specific examples or stories that can bring this to life? So it makes more sense what this might look like in practice.
Do you want it from a cognitive intention perspective? So if we cement it in CDT, then when you look at people like Elliot Jacks's span of discretion, the difference between somebody who works on what would it be called on a workshop floor, on a factory floor, where you're on the conveyor belt and you're doing things in the moment, right? Your level of thinking only needs to be sufficient to think about what's going to happen now, and when my lunch break, and maybe what I'm having for dinner tonight. But if you run General Electric and you've got 50 divisions and you have to have a 25-year policy on how to run ABC, then your span of discretion is this long as opposed to this long, right? So which are the cognitive intentions that combine to create the thinking necessary for the boss at GE to perform well in his job? And which ones would he not need that would actually make him burn out and leave because the job is greater than him? Does that make sense? So for example, it would be global. So you have global details in the abstract concrete, but we need somebody who's got future. And predominantly what I found with the students was the ones who were at the lower end of the scale only did short-term thinking, or they were stuck in the past. So you got past, present, future. The boss, this is another one, from an SME perspective, or say the boss again at GE, how are we forced to think as an SME? It might be short to medium term. Whereas the boss at GE can think longer term because they've got whatever backup they've got lots of money and so on and so forth. However, the context again frames our thinking. So in order to map to that frame, the boss at GE, different to the SME, has to have the long-term global and abstract thinking, as well as potentially relationships rather than task, because they're the boss of 1,000 people rather than the boss of 3 people. So the SME might need to have, well, I need to get this stuff done today and tomorrow. So instead of focusing on long-term thinking and the general ideas and principles like abstract and global, they focus on tasks because I need to get it done. And they might be considerate of the relationship between the person doing the task and the task itself, but then they might not necessarily give it as much thought consciously in the moment to warrant a change in thinking should something happen to that person and they can't come in. That's the only time that it happens, is when something disrupts their thinking, because Billy can't come in anymore and it's disrupted their entire day. So from a different context, you've got SMEs and GE, you have a different construction, which means you have a different thinking style for each person. And we go back to dynamic intelligence, where you combine all of these cognitive intentions to create the thinking style. And what I would hope to see is that the SME is, around TQ6 on the Stevens scale, and this guy is around TQ8 or so, because he's got a different way of balancing his thinking for the longer term, the bigger frame, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. So you talked there about kind of TQ6, TQ7. If we kind of take that up to the top of the tree, if you like, what would someone act or think like who is at that really the highest level that you can attain in this?
TQ10, and in reality, it's kind of like Maslow's self-actualization level. I'm not going to go into Ken Wilber and spirituality and turquoise and all this other stuff because I don't actually agree with it. But it's not something you can attain. No one is TQ10. So someone will ask me, Darren, what level are you on your own system? And I'm probably, I don't know, about 8.2. And they say, why aren't you 10? So because it's my system, it doesn't mean I can do it. But in reality, what it means is that a TQ10 is an ideal where everything is a construction. You, Sean, me, I'm constructing you and I'm aware of it. You're constructing me and I'm aware of your construction, but also family, society, organizations, the news media, nothing is true per se. It's all a construction. The difference is at TQ10, the person knows that they construct their environment, their society to suit them. Whereas at TQ8, the constructed nature of the environment actually impacts me to the point where I construct me to fit in my environment. So there's a different intention at the top end. And a friend of mine asked me, she looked at the scale and said, are the TQ10 happy? Are the TQ10 people happy? And I said, well, you're misunderstanding TQ10. They know that happy is a construct. And it doesn't matter, they construct happy, they construct sad. In the moment, it makes no difference to them whether they're perceived as happy or perceived as sad, because your perception of them isn't their construction of self. And it's these kinds of ideas at the highest level that are so esoteric and abstract that I would, when we're running workshops based on this, yes, we absolutely use that as the benchmark for how we should think and construct in the long term. But we absolutely full well know that we construct here, and this is the ideal. You know what I mean? So because we know this is the ideal, we can work towards it. And using the identity compass, we know which ones we need to tweak in order to get the growth for balance, between internal, external, towards, away from, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so you're talking about the tweaks there. So do you have an example of a how-to then in terms of that tweaking?
Yeah, I mean, let's make it simple and use students. Students are young, so they lack the experiential complexity, if you will. And what they tend to do is they tend to place all the authority onto the teacher, onto the lecturer. That's an external locus of evaluation. The university tells me what I must do and what rules I have to follow. The lecturer tells me how I write and how I construct my own work. And then I'm beholden to the lecturer to grade me and tell me how great I am or not, So it's all an external. Now, that's useful in academia. And I did, using the 8,000 profiles, I did actually differentiate between how a master's level student thinks and how the general population thinks. And there are differences. The student also wants to have achievement high because give me the degree. I want the degree, I want the certificate. So there is a difference in how a student constructs their thinking and how the general public constructs their thinking. But from an external perspective, what I do with some of the students who are really too external, I tell them to focus on internal. Run it through your system first. How do you feel about that? How does it make you think when you hear this feedback or you see whatever you see? And by virtue of the fact that they're running it through their own system, they might still be external for another month or two. But the shift in the intention is the thing that makes their awareness rise up to create choice later when they respond. So a month down the line, all of a sudden, they're no longer massively external. They can actually choose to say, actually, I'm not taking that feedback. I don't agree with that feedback. Whereas before, if they were really external and the feedback was negative, it would hurt them. It would hurt their feelings, and it allows for a certain element of self-confidence to come out. And that's one of the main things I actually do for students when I'm feeding back profiles.
Okay, so what you were describing there sounds a little bit like the type of coaching that I might be doing if I was as at work. And I know that kind of, within the workplace now, there's this idea of manager as coach and trying to build a coaching organization. But it also sounded like what you were saying there was that you need to understand the meaning making of the person that you're trying to assist and develop their thinking. I mean, how would I know if my manager was at the right level, or how would I know if they were almost kind of bringing me down rather than developing me?
That's a great question. That's a great point, because in the talks in my system, and don't get me wrong, I'm not the only one who says this. Lasky says this as well. Somebody at TQ5 on my scale cannot coach someone at TQ9, right? TQ10's as we've said.
Yeah.
Because this person has balance in nearly all of their cognitive intentions. They have awareness and choice in how they respond in the moment. This person doesn't have that kind of balance and doesn't have that kind of awareness. How can this coach at TQ5 see the balance and the self-awareness of this person and offer any advice at all? And the thing that really riles me up about this is the approach by coaching federations and even the BPS, where they use a profile, I beg your pardon, where they use a coaching process like GROW, something like that, right? Well, just because you use a process to coach someone doesn't mean you actually understand the word they're saying. And that process won't transfer to the TQ9 person if you are constructing them through your TQ5 lens and invariably getting their TQ9 thinking wrong. Because how can you get it right if you're not looking at it from the same level? And it sounds harsh, but for me, it's a much more ethical framework, especially from coaching. Now, I know you and I know where your thinking is, and I would be happy with you coaching all your clients because you're not TQ5. Simple as that. If you were, I would be, offering to coach you and say, let's quickly get you up and up. Because for me, it's an integrity perspective. Don't pump out NLP based coaches because they've done a 2-day course on a weekend and then they can go off and pretend they're doing some form of therapy. And I've seen it a lot. I mean, I've been doing NLP for years, and you see it where they think they're separate from everybody else because they're special. And I'm not kidding. I've seen that in the conferences. So for me, an ethical framework is actually, let's develop this guy so that they can at least go to here, which means they can then coach everybody there downwards. Because if they meet somebody who's, let's get him up to TQ7, if they meet somebody else at TQ7, that's not a coaching relationship. That's just a developmental dialogue.
Yeah.
And once they develop themselves, then it becomes a coach, because then only then do they actually see the patterns of their client. Up to that point, they'll recognize the patterns, but they won't know how to change them because that's where they are. So and I equate this to I play squash and I train in a martial art. If I want to get better at either of those things, I play somebody who is much better than me, or I get beaten up by somebody who is much better than me. If I train with a beginner, of course I'm going to beat them, whether I'm playing squash or martial arts, because they don't have what I have. And by virtue of that, I train my Sifu and he beats me up without even thinking about it. It's a piece of cake for him because he's there and I'm here. And that's all it boils down to. So whether you're coaching someone or, developing them, this scale of where you sit on the thinking quotient scale is very, very important.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think organisations like the International Coach Federation, they have the ideas, the ethics are built in there. I just don't think that, at least until now, until your theory and the idea of and the thinking quotient, there wasn't a way to enable those ethics in some way. But yeah. On the topic then of coaching, apart from providing that kind of ethical framework, ability to implement an ethical framework almost, how else does it act as a differentiator from other developmental type coaching?
It acts as a differentiator because it's about the pattern recognition, but the pattern recognition is specific to cognitive intention use. So where other systems might listen out for, I know Lasky actually what Lasky does is he asks questions and then transcribes the interview. And then afterwards, someone goes through, whoever's been trained in his CDF program, goes through it and circles the bits to the high level or determines the level. Well, what we're doing is CDT is about in the moment awareness. So if we couldn't do this in the moment, it kind of ruins the whole theory. So as we're listening to our clients, what I'm listening for is their limitations. So not only does it tell you what level they're at, but it also tells you what level they're not. So you can ask a question and you can determine where they are on an abstract way of thinking. And I did this just the other day. I asked a question about, in essence, it was the A is held in place by the not A, right? Now that is philosophical and not everybody's going to get it, but I used it specifically to gauge how aware they were of abstract thinking, right? And global, so big picture. Okay. So by asking a few choice questions on the top, say 5 cognitive intentions, because what I did was in the factor analysis of the 8,000 profiles in my thesis, it told me that the top cognitive intentions are, for example, abstract concrete, even internal and external came out there, right?
Mm.
How aware we are of our use of global and abstract is key. So I flipped it around and said, well, instead of trying to find out where they are, let's find out where they're not and work our way down, because you get there quicker. There's no point in me assuming you personally are TQ5 when I know you're not, right? I might as well start at TQ8 and come down because I'll catch you quicker. So that's how it works. I'm listening for the patterns, but I'm asking specific questions that tease out their level of awareness. And if they're aware and have the, aware of the intention behind the principles and ideas of what it is they're talking about in the room, in the moment. If they're not aware of the principles because they don't get a high level question, then we ask a different question that's a little less complex. And then we can gauge where they are at that point. So does that make sense? We differentiate based on the pattern recognition. So I listen for how you construct your thinking, ask you a question based on your construction, and work my way up or down depending on where we are.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. So what you're trying to do is identify those blind spots, if you like, in their thinking, and bring that awareness to them and encourage them to think in that way.
Yeah.
As opposed to, as you said, just using a formula, a process.
And that's the point now. So not only is it more ethical, but actually it's got a better integrity ratio because I'm actually focused on you. And I'm not using GROW to figure out your thinking. I'm using your thinking to figure out your thinking. Now, I said earlier that I don't do therapy. A friend of mine has 3 therapists. And he came and said, Darren, I need to talk to you. I said, look, mate, I'm not a therapist. You know this. He said, yeah, but what they do is a therapist will grab you and they have a set way of thinking. This is how you should be in the world. And they try to steer your thinking and behaving into the boxes that fit their paradigm. He says, you don't do that, Darren. I said, well, of course I don't. I listen for how you construct you and we go from there. He said, yeah, and I like that. And even though he was low level, I pointed out his patterns to him. So I actually wrote his patterns down. And then I got a grid out, which this is all part and parcel of the framework for constructive developmental coaching, which is obviously a workshop and people can join in. And I take the grid and I said to him, look, this phrase that you use a lot, put it on the grid. Where do you think it is? Is it TQ5, 6, 7, 8? He put it at TQ5. He knew that way of thinking was low level, was limited. He knew it and he had no problem explaining it to me. We have a benchmark for his growth right there. You know what I mean? And I didn't tell him that his thinking is wrong because it's not wrong. It's how he constructs himself in the moment. His environment is different to my environment. He might need to construct himself that way in order to cope in his own environment. What needs to change is his awareness of his construction, so he's not limited by the external factors coming at him all the time, so he can respond to them differently, or let's say qualitatively better.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we've spoken a lot about coaching, but you mentioned therapy there. I mean, does your theory have wider applications beyond adult development, kind of from a coaching and perspective? Does it have therapeutic implications as well?
Yeah, I've got in contact with a few clinical psychologists and a couple of therapists who want to use it as a framework for therapy. One guy is actually using intention awareness choice response as a framework for therapy, and I'm talking with him again next week. It's really interesting because when a clinical therapist says that you come home from work and you're drained because you're emotionally drained, you're in bed, I say, well, why are you not at such a level that you can say, this is not my issue, it's their issue. And in order for me to go into their world and become empathically embedded in their emotional trauma, means I'm not in charge. I'm not in control of me. I don't have sufficient dynamic intelligence to step back. So I offered this to her and she, thought about it for a minute and said, that's really interesting because everybody I know has a bad day. But if you can consciously not jump into your patient's world, because it's a patient for them, not a client, the patient's world, the patient's trauma, and you do that from a position of awareness, then you protect your own mental health, your own sense of self. that's what's being, I'm working on that now as we speak, to create some form of workshop that takes a clinical psychologist or a forensic psychologist up to the point where they're aware in the moment of their intention, awareness, choice, and response. Yeah, because if they get bogged down by the emotional aspects of their patient, how useful is that? It's not, you know?
It's really interesting, and it's obvious that the work that you've done, your theory has got really quite wide-ranging implications. But if we kind of come back to where it started for in stage theory, I mean, what are the consequences for existing stage theory if your new theory gains some traction?
Well, we don't need stages. Now, I'm not the only one to say this. Okay, I went to something called ESRAD, which is a European Society for Research and Adult Development. I got it. And I talked with a bunch of people over there. And these are guys like Michael Commons, Michael Moscolo, Michael Bachetz. These are the guys that actually started adult development in the early 80s. And I drew the developmental onion at this conference about 4 years ago. And I showed it to Michael Bachetz. And I said, look, don't need stages. And he went, yeah, I like that. I'm okay with that. And I'm like, oh, I thought he was going to shout at me, you know, because that's all they've done is stages. And he's like, no, it's fine. It's fine. I know we don't need stages. I sent him my thesis. We've talked about it. One of the points is when you understand that internal, external, that is different to that, you know, that is different to balance, which is different to that. Every 5% from an identity compass perspective, every 5% could be considered a step or a stage, right? And this is the thing, but it's not. Yeah, you know what I mean? And for me, it's about the level of awareness, but the level is, again, we go back to what we said at the very beginning, we're restricted by our language. So one of the problems with stage development is that everybody looks for a stage. So all the researchers have been convinced that we have stages of development. So what do they look for in their research? Stages. Yes?
Yeah.
It becomes a tautological argument. So what I've said is I'm okay calling it a stage if we want to call it a stage, but let's actually look at it from a position of, well, and right now on the screen, what I should do is put on the actual onion so that people watching this can see the onion. You know, actually it's about, if I need to focus on procedures because I'm not very procedural, then I focus on it sufficiently so that the next time I need it, I just have to revisit it rather than relearn it. And that's part of the onion. So CDT has the potential to move us away from the need for stages and put in there intention, awareness, choice, response. Okay. And I think those 4 pillars are key. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I very clearly, and I've spoken to other coaches about, you know, just those four pillars, and they absolutely get it. It seems strange that it is taken kind of this long, and someone, you know, like yourself, to actually codify that and say, no, this is it. It's really yeah, it's really powerful. It's really powerful, Darren. So just to finish off then, right, what is the point of knowing your TQ score or your thinking style or your level of dynamic intelligence?
What a great question. I think it goes back to what Einstein said. If you're not here to develop yourself, what are you here for? You know, what's the point? If I know that I'm limited in some aspect of my thinking, and it could be the dialectic, it could be the idea, the opposite idea, and you put them together, you get a new idea, right? Where we struggle as a species is this opposite idea. We're getting entrenched in our beliefs, we're getting entrenched in our own thoughts, and we think that they're true. And then when somebody offers us something that's the opposite, we get something called cognitive dissonance. Okay. The key to complex thinking is having 2 things held as truth at the same time without getting cognitive dissonance. And for me, constructive development theory uncovers our hypocrisy. So don't get me wrong, my 16-year-old daughter is awesome at pointing out my hypocrisy. But when I'm talking about, I say this, but I do this, what am I not seeing that's just as important? And from a developmental perspective, we have a benchmark, and constructive development theory offers you a benchmark with a TQ score. And from there, it's growth upwards. But it's not growth that way, which is a university course, or, it's growth that way. And that for me is what's missing from universities, from organizations, from everywhere, because that might be my bias. But complexity, vertical development, constructive development is what's missing.
Excellent. It's been really great talking with you this afternoon, Darren. Thank you so much for taking the time out, and I hope everyone watching this enjoys it as much as I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. It's been brilliant.